Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take a look at a generic XML handler that comes from the simple API for XML. Now, I've provided you some additional documentation along with this video, so you will not need to type along necessarily with all of the code that I've written, but instead just simply bring it into your project and put it in the appropriate locations. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to take a look at the simple API for XML. Notice that this is not an Oracle project. This is actually a third-party project that was derived by a group of individuals, or has been supported by a group of individuals, and is now on a version 2.01. What we're going to do is we're going to leverage this library, which is available in the Java framework, can be accessed through NetBeans. We're going to leverage this library and we're going to extend these classes that are in this library to build our own custom XML parser. Now, for part of this demo, what I'm going to use is I'm actually going to use this quick start. So you want to go ahead and bookmark it. It's one of the links that I have provided. But specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this default handler class that we are going to extend. The idea is that we want to be able to read in an XML file and turn it into a user object. Now, just a quick reminder of what XML looks like. You see here that I've created a simple XML file. In this case, we're going to call it sample.xml. It has all of the information that our .user file has, but in a different format. And notice now how this nesting format here, where we have a user, and then nested inside of those tags is an ID, in this case, G. Myers, and so on. And so the main pattern to note here is that for every open tag, there is a closed tag. And the idea is that you can nest these tags to create nested objects. Now, in our case, our sample.xml, and by virtue of that, our user is a pretty straightforward object. There is no nested, no nesting, there are no collections or anything like that. So this is going to be a fairly straightforward example. Well, what we want to do now is we want to look at how this default handler, or rather extending this default handler, can then be used to read this XML file. So once again, I provided you this code. It's GenericXMLHandler.java. You need to include it in your project, as well as another file we'll take a look at in just a second. But the first thing I want us to do is sort of understand the anatomy of this class. And once again, this is part of the quick start. So you'll notice first that it has a static void method. In this case, I've called it parse document. The method throws an exception that must be handled by whatever your calling code is. So you have to put whatever code calls this function has to be inside of a try catch. And that's once again a choice whether you want to handle the exception inside the static method or if you want to handle it outside. But note in this case that the function here, this static function, has a void return. In other words, it does not return anything. So you would have a little bit of difficulty getting any sort of response back to the calling code. So that's the first thing that you should note is here we're throwing an exception because there is no way to return a value in this function. Now, continuing on, you'll see that we've got a couple of new classes here that we've not seen before. An XML reader. Notice the package that it's in. It's an org.xml.sax package that we have not seen yet. As with anything like this, you can always go to navigate and go to source, and you can actually look at the source code for the XML reader and look at some of the the methods associated with it. We're not going to spend as much time with the XML reader as we will with the default handler in just a second. But you'll notice here also that it's using a factory method. Okay, there is no new constructor. Instead, it uses a factory method that creates an XML reader. The next step that we want to do is in our public static void, we actually want to create a handler that is of type generic XML handler. So basically our static function is creating an object of the class that it is a part of. So notice this is public static void parse document is a static method within the generic XML handler class, but it can also create an instance of that generic XML handler. From there, then what we do is we take that handler and we assign it to the set content handler function. And essentially what this does is this assigns the behavior that we want to have happen when a new event is triggered. So what's going to happen here is the XML reader is going to trigger events as it's parsing our XML file, and our handler is going to handle those events. And so the two in particular that we're interested in is essentially what you would think of as the output handler, meaning the output from the file, or in this case, they call it a content handler, and then the error handlers. In other words, what functions do we want to call when a particular event happens? And so you can see that our generic XML handler has some void functions here. We'll start with our start document, end document, start element, end element, and also characters, so that this allows for us then to see the start and end of the document, the start and end of an individual element, as well as the characters inside or in between the tags. Now note that none of these functions have a return value. So this is going to present us with an interesting challenge when we start building our user object. So this one is purely meant for demonstration. Now, the other thing to note here is that we have a call to the super constructor of our generic XML handler. Basically, this relies then on the default handler class to do the initial setup. So if we go to source here, you'll see that a default handler implements several interfaces, but also you'll see some of the methods associated with a default handler. You'll see here one that we will use in just a second. There's our start document, there's our end document, but most importantly, notice that it does nothing other than throw an exception currently. And so that's the reason why we have carefully named some of our functions here to essentially override the behavior in the underlying class. Okay, so in other words, when we start the document, we want to throw an exception. We want to at least acknowledge it to the user. Once again, notice that none of these methods have any returns. Now, our start element's a little different. It accepts a number of input arguments, which we will actually leverage, particularly the URI, the name of the tag, the fully qualified name, and then any attributes associated with that tag, as well as the end element. It uses the URI, the name of the tag, and then the fully qualified name of the tag. The characters function essentially just collects all of the characters in a given subset of the string that it is parsing. So from the start point and some length of characters, and then it just simply loops through them, aggregates them, and then in this particular case, then we are printing out anything that does not qualify as one of these values right here. So essentially what this does is this is a fancy white space limiter, eliminator, the way it's set up. The only white space, of course, that it keeps is the space between valid characters. So this basically gets rid of the new line, carriage return, tab, and so on. Now, Coming back up here one more time, you'll see that after we have set those methods to respond to those events, then we create a new file reader object that essentially will stream the contents of our input file. We're doing no error checking or anything along those lines, so we don't even know if we've got a valid file. That needs to be handled either in a later video or by you to make this code a little more robust. But then the last step here is to parse, then using that XML reader to parse the file that you have just opened with the file reader, but we want to turn that file reader now into a SACS input source. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to stream the file to the XML reader. A little bit strange, probably not something that you have done before, but you can sort of think of it a little bit like standing at the end of a conveyor belt and you have items coming at you and you have to triage what is useful information with respect to your object versus what you discard, or in this case, your tags. Now, the only other thing to point out is essentially your tags help to describe what the useful data is. Now, before we run this, I want us to take a look now at the user XML handler. Now I've taken the generic XML handler and I have now converted it into something a little bit more specific to our application. But essentially what I've done is I've tried to keep the fundamentals of the generic XML handler so you can see then how you would go about parsing out the useful information. So the first thing I did, and keep in mind, there are a few other ways to go about doing this, but the first thing that I did is I created a bunch of temporary variables that corresponded to the properties that I wanted to capture out of the XML file as it was being streamed to me. And one of the ways that I did this was just simply creating this chunk variable. And so if you'll note down here at the bottom in your characters function, that you simply just print out the individual character. And so what I did in this characters function, I'm going to scroll down real quick. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit so you can see how the pieces of this work. Is essentially what I did is I aggregated all of those characters into a chunk. Now, what I then did is after opening the file, either recognizing it as a string or as a java.io file, either scenario works. After opening the file, setting up the file reader and the XML reader, at that point, then I would make the call to the XML parse function and I would parse that open file. Well, parsing that open file would then trigger all of these event handlers, the identification, the start of the document, the end of the document, and so on. And when I started a particular element, what I would do is I would clear out that temporary chunk variable. And whenever I ended an element or closed a tag, I would simply check to see what tag did I just close. Now notice I'm making an assumption here that this is a very simple object structure. This could get a little more sophisticated as you went along. But effectively what I did here is I would triage what the tag name was, or in this case, the fully qualified tag name. And depending on what that tag was, I would take whatever the value was stored in the chunk variable before it was cleared by the next element, and I would assign it to the corresponding property that was associated with that tag name. So in this case, if it was the ID, then this.id would then hold the value that was stored in between the ID tags. Okay, so basically once I parse this close ID tag, I would recognize that the data that I just collected in my chunks variable was actually supposed to be the ID. And I would do this for each one of the critical fields that I was interested in capturing, with the slight caveat that with status, I also had to parse a string into an enum, which is the reason for this try catch block that I have. The only other thing to notice real quick is this is an unorthodox use of a switch case. Java allows for you to compare string values. This is not extremely well used. It's not universally used. be quite frank with you, I'm not exactly sure. This is not supported in every language, but it is supported in both the Java and in the .NET framework. So this is a neat little trick. And also notice the breaks that are in each one of the cases. That's by necessity, so you don't fall into the next case. And then, of course, lastly, down here at the default, you just simply want to print out whether you have an unhandled tag. Now, we will actually have an unhandled tag because technically I'm not doing anything when I hit my user tag. All right, so that should hopefully give you a good overview of how this XML handler works. Once again, you can kind of imagine yourself standing at the end of a conveyor belt with things coming at you, and you basically, every time you pick something up, you have to identify what it is. Is it a tag? Okay, if it's a start tag, then I need to identify that I have just started a new element. At that point, then I need to start capturing the data that's inside the element. Is it an end tag? Then that lets me know that I can move on to the next piece of data. Now, inside of our import XML, and we're going to focus on the java.io.file version. Essentially, they are very similar. The main difference being is that this is accepting a file where the other one accepts a string. So you just use a different overload of your parser here. We'll see in just a second what I mean. Notice I'm creating a file reader here because I have a file to work with. But once we have parsed the file, then once we're done and we want to check, did I successfully capture a ID? Did I capture a first name? And did I capture a last name? Why did I pick those three properties? Well, they correspond to the constructor overload that requires then a pre-described ID. In other words, if we have an ID, we want to use it. Technically speaking, we could also do this and use the second overload in an else if, where we were only provided the first name and last name. If you're unsure of what I'm talking about, you can actually look back to an earlier video to see the two constructors in our user.java. Now, from there, we essentially create or initialize a new user using that ID, first name, last name, and then we simply go about setting the properties of that user using the temporary values that were captured by the handler. And then at that point, we simply return the user. If there are any issues, we print out an exception and we return either a partially constructed user or a null. So you're going to want to need to have some error checking on the calling function to determine what the state of the user is. Or if you notice the other difference here, you could also throw the exception and let that be handled in the calling function. So that's another minor difference here. In the first example, the import XML, the main function that we have here, this parse document, threw the exception and required that the calling code handled it. In this particular example here, I'm essentially swallowing the exception, but ideally what you would do is you would want to triage the behavior, maybe create a partially constructed user or a partially initialized user. Once again, go back to one of the previous videos if you'd like to see a better explanation of that. And we talked about this when we were creating our user object and the constructors associated with it. Now, the only other thing that I want to point out briefly before we leave this document here is our import XML, which takes the string overload. You'll notice that it's slightly different in that it has, instead of a java.io.file reader, that it has a string reader. And essentially what you're doing is you're streaming a string to your XML reader. Okay, so I call this a stream reader. You could also call it a string reader. It doesn't really matter. As a matter of fact, the idea is kind of universal between the two frameworks. But the idea here is you're bringing it as a string instead of a file. At that point, then the code is essentially the same. We parse the entire string. We see whether or not there was an ID, a first name and last name. If there was, you construct the object, else you return null. So some cleanup work can be done here, some little bit of improvement on the error handling, etc. But fundamentally what we have here is a working XML parser. So how do we make this work? Well, the first thing that we want to do now is we want to come out here to our user driver. And I've given you this code in a snips.java file. And you'll see what I've done here is I've basically just added a couple of more cases to our if statement here, so our switch handler. And the main thing here that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure that whenever I call my generic XML handler, that I also have a file that contains a .xml file extension. And so it's essentially all I'm doing here. So I've got a compound if statement here so that I have two arguments. One of the arguments is the generic XML handler, and the second one says, does that second argument contain .xml? Now notice I'm doing something very, very similar for the other two, with the main difference here is I'm just simply providing a different arg0. Let's briefly take a look at what each one of these does. The first one simply calls that generic XML handler .parse document. That first function that we saw, that first static function, if there's any issues, it simply catches the exception, prints the exception to the command line. Note here, we had to do this because the parse document threw the exception. In other words, it didn't want to handle the exception itself. It threw it to its calling function. The second and third examples don't need the try catch because we chose to handle the exception inside. The difference here is that I'm using now my import XML of my user XML handler. So this is kind of generic. This one just shows you how your XML handler works. These two examples actually go through and they import the XML to create now a new user object. Quickest way to check to see that the user is actually successfully created is, of course, to turn around and export it. Now, in this case, I chose to export custom because I thought it would be kind of neat to be able to convert from an XML file into a custom format so you can sort of see, get an opportunity to see how this works. And likewise, down here in the second example, with the big difference is I'm also using my import string function to open the file up, to read it, and then essentially pass the string itself to the import XML function. I did this just to have a little more flexibility. The other thing to note real quick is I borrowed my import string from my user panel.java. You could technically have made this a public function, a public static function if you wanted to, but for this demonstration, I just opted to literally copy and paste this code into the user driver, and you see it hanging out down here at the bottom. Once again, you've got all of this code already. If you've been working along with these videos, you should have this particular section of code as well. The whole purpose with this is it just takes a file, takes the contents out of the file, and returns it as a string with the new lines in it. All right, so let's see how this works. So I'm going to come over here to my command window. I'm going to clear my screen. Let me bring it over here so that you could see it. I'm going to go ahead and do a dir here. You'll notice that I've done one other thing. I've brought my sample.xml over here. You should have a copy of it already. If not, this is what your sample.xml should look like. This is just a generic header for an XML file. But let's see how this works here. So the first thing we want to do here is we want to call Java EE333, and we're going to call our user driver. And now this takes us just a little bit here to remember what our switches are, or you can do a little bit of copying and pasting. We're going to try to run our generic XML handler first, and we want to pass to it this sample.xml that we have sitting in the directory. And you'll notice here that what it does is it essentially creates a lot of noise. You can imagine for a longer XML file, there would be a lot of noise on the command line. But effectively, what you're doing here is you start the document, okay? You'll see that at the start of the document, then you then jump into the first element of the document. The first element of the document is the user. You can see the URI, the name, and the start element all corresponding to that first element. I included the URI and the name in my print statements because I thought it would be useful for you to see the difference. There's not a lot of a difference in this particular example because this is a fairly simple XML file, fairly simple object. But the most important thing to note here is that you're starting an element ID, you're capturing the characters G. Myers, and then you're ending the element ID. Then you start the first name, capture the characters Gregory, end the element, and so on, all the way down until you end element status. And then finally, then you have the user and you end element user. And then lastly, you end the document. All right. So that gets us through the generic XML handler, which effectively does nothing other than parse the file and then print it to the command window. So we'd like to be able to do something a little bit more useful. And that then is where our user XML handler, the one that we have created, where this comes into play. And what we do here now is let's change our switches. So we'll switch now to our user XML handler import XML file. We specify once again the same file, the sample.xml, none of that changes, but you'll notice now a lot less noise because I have removed a lot of the print lines, but more importantly, identify the start and end of the document. And notice now you also have that unhandled tag user, because technically we don't do anything with the user tag. There are things that you would consider doing in the future, but in our simple example, there was nothing to be done with the user. But more importantly, after I end the document, then you notice that I actually have created a user. And how do you know this? Well, if you go back to the user XML handler, remember that the return value for both of our import functions was to return a user. That user got returned then to the calling function, which in this case was the main for our command line application. And then we printed out the users, the contents of the user using the export custom format. And we simply printed that fancy toString to the command line. And you should see, if you've got this set up correctly, if you've got all of your things in the correct location, you should now see your user in the custom format. And just to check, verify that our other function works, I'd like to quickly change then our import XML file to import XML string. And you'll notice that yes, it too, in fact, works. The main difference, of course, is that it first reads the file and converts it into a string and then passes the string to our import XML function. So in both cases, just to sum up, essentially what we're doing is we're building a new user, essentially using these static functions that are part of this user XML handler class. So essentially what we have is we have somewhat of a factory method here. The only behavior to note here is that the XML handler, in this case a user XML handler, needs to know a little bit about the user. And so we'll see in the next video where you would actually want to tighten this up a little bit, in other words, you would probably want to have your XML handler be some portion of your user class, perhaps a private class associated with it. But essentially, this is a factory method or a way of creating a user, much like a constructor would. But in this case, then it uses a custom format. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me. Thank you for watching.